The weekly Cybercrime and Business Podcast is brought to you by Surfwatch Labs. Surfwatch Labs delivers cyber risk intelligence solutions that help organizations understand the potential for cyber attacks, determine the impact to their business, and proactively address threats head-on. Hey everybody, today is April 24th, 2015. I am Jeff Peters, the Hack Surfer editor. I'm here with Matt Leifus, Hack Surfer writer, and Michael Thel, Surfwatch Labs data analyst. Coming up after the news and discussion, we have an interview with Kevin Epstein. He's the Vice President of Advanced Security and Governance for Proofpoint. And they just released their Human Factor Report 2015, which is about all the different trends in phishing that have changed since their last report in 2014. So it was a pretty interesting conversation. But yeah, before we get into that stuff, throw it over to you, Matt, for the top headlines from the week.
Coming at number 3 this week, we had an Israeli company called Fab Molds. Fab Molds is the owner of the Israeli arm importer Fab Defense. They got a website you can go to. Check that out. They were part of the Op Israel attacks this year, the annual attack that Anonymous pulls off and brags about and talks about. They were able to leak some login personal information on several of local and international clients, and some of those clients were government officials. Coming in number 2 this week, and I thought this was actually a pretty interesting story. It was Pinnacle Law Firm. This is an Arkansas-based law firm. They're representing 3 police officers that are accusing their police department of kind of being corrupt. And the law firm is actually now kind of adding fuel to the fire. They're claiming that this same police department attempted to spy in some of the behind the scenes in the lawsuit to kind of understand, what kind of information they had on the officers and things like that. An attorney for the law firm, Matt Campbell, sent a hard drive to this police department to get emails and any information relevant to the case. When that police department sent back the hard drive, Campbell found that it was infected with 3 well-known Trojans, including a backdoor and, as they said, a password-sniffing keylogger. So I thought that was kind of an interesting story. Way to go, law enforcement. And number 1 this week, we have HSBC. This was a breach that affected mortgage customers. HSBC discovered a breach of their network on March 27th. The breach lasted from late 2014 and ended in early 2015. The breach affected 10 finance subsidiaries in 4 states for HSBC. It's an unknown number of mortgage customers that were affected, but some researchers have actually gone on record saying that the figure could be substantial. And that's the top news this week.
Yeah, so I thought it would be interesting since RSA is this week and everyone's sort of been talking about RSA and chatting about RSA and a lot of companies are there, including Surfwatch Labs. I thought it'd be interesting to just kind of run down some of the highlights of what happened at RSA this week. One thing everyone's been talking about is this keynote address by RSA President Amit Yoran. In his keynote address, he said that the security industry is failing, said it has failed. He also said that, we're losing the contest and the adversaries are outmaneuvering the industry. So a lot of people have been sort of picking up on that. And I guess if you look at the numbers, it's kind of true. Last year, according to the Identity Theft Resource Center, there was 738 data breaches, and that was up 25% from the previous year. Bruce Schneider, the computer researcher, is pretty famous. He was there on Tuesday addressing a large crowd, and according to the Examiner, they said that he offered a supremely dark view of the computerized future, one which our failure to properly secure technology may lead to what he termed the age of catastrophic risk. On one hand, you got the RSA president saying that, we're failing, and then you have a lot of these other presentations and addresses where people are saying things are going to get worse and they don't really know or have answers and things like that.
Something I also found interesting was Richard A. Clarke, the former advisor on cybersecurity to the president, and the same gentleman who was testifying in front of the 9/11 Commission, in one of his talks at RSA, warned the conference of cybersecurity increasingly targeting intellectual property. And I think that's one of the big risks that people always kind of forget is we always get stuck in the weeds and talking about this piece of malware and this and that, but we don't really focus on the effects of what are people going after. Granted, a lot of cyber criminals go after credit card numbers and personally identifiable information, but a lot of them also go after intellectual property that could have long-term effects on corporations and small businesses and other organizations.
Everyone's been talking about this mobile malware threat's been getting reported on quite a bit the last year. So I thought some of the research that came out from Google and Damballa at RSA was pretty interesting. Damballa, they said that, sort of the big headline from their research that they conducted, they looked at 50% of U.S. mobile traffic, and they found that you're 1.3 times more likely to get struck by lightning than have mobile malware communicating on your device. So that's sort of the big headline that's been getting reported on. And they sort of compared the mobile threat to Ebola in the United States. Yes, it's harmful, but it's greatly over-exaggerated, and it's contained to a really limited percentage of the population that are engaging in behavior that puts them at risk.
This really surprises me, considering, everyone has a cell phone now. They're with us 24/7. They connect to other things. And, in my brief stint here with Surfwatch Labs, I've heard a lot of people talk, in fear about what could happen with your mobile device. So when we were going through this, this stat really surprised me. But then again, when you're looking back through our data and everything, you don't see a lot of that. The threat is there, but I guess it's right. You don't actually see a lot of mobile device leading to this or whatever else. But it still, to me, is pretty shocking. I can't believe that you're 1.3 times more likely to be struck by lightning than have mobile malware communicating on your device. I think that's really surprising.
Yeah, and we've seen a lot of headlines, at least I have, where it says, 99% of Android devices are vulnerable, or 80% of Android devices are vulnerable. And Google's lead Android engineer, Adrian Ludwig, he was presenting at RSA, and he kind of highlighted some of these stats from Blue Box about two of the exploits against Android. And he said, for example, one of them, even though 99% of Android users were at risk at the time of disclosure, it was only leveraged less than 8 times per 1 million devices. And another one that had 82% of Android users at risk was once per 1 million. So, even though a lot of people might be vulnerable or at risk, and you see these big headlines, it seems to me, at least according to this data that and Damballa's data, that it's really not as much of a threat as people are making it out to be. So that's what I thought was really the most interesting thing from all these RSA articles that I've read. Anybody else have anything that stood out to them from the RSA coverage this week?
Yeah, there was one that actually, it was another one that really stood out to me because when I first, again, with my short stint here, we talked, last year there was a lot of POS breaches, point of sale breaches. And two gentlemen, self-described fraud fighters, David Byrne and Charles Henderson, they spoke at RSA. And they spoke at length about an unnamed company that they said it's one of the world's largest point of sale vendors, has been using the same password since 1990. So 25 years, one of the world's largest point of sale vendors has been using the same password. On top of that, 90% of this unknown company, unnamed company's customer base, 90% of them are doing the same exact thing. So that could be a pretty catastrophic data breach if that password were ever to be exploited. We're going back to the very beginning, how they said at RSA that cybersecurity has failed. Well, I think right there, that's one of the big reasons. Right, that's just, you can't do that in today's society. I was very shocked by that as well. And the other movement that kind of came out, that again, this is actually to me kind of funny. The Department of Defense and Department of Homeland Security have plans in place that they announced at RSA to set up a satellite office in Silicon Valley. Secretary Johnson of the Department of Homeland Security actually went on record and was quoted saying, "I hope some of you listening will consider a tour of service for your country." He was speaking to some of the cybersecurity experts and up-and-coming people. I kind of think this is funny. We'll see how that goes and how that all works out. But
yeah, I'm a little more cynical regarding this new policy, just given the levels of bureaucratic nightmares that cybersecurity folks have to deal with in the government. I mean, there's statistics and reports coming out that the government's having problems recruiting cyber professionals because of the bureaucracy and the antiquated hiring process and how wages aren't keeping up with the private sector. So, I mean, good for them for trying this, but I doubt, again, being a cynic, I doubt that this is going to actually work and they're going to come back with their tail between their legs.
Well, it's kind of hard for, Silicon Valley kind of views from experts I've talked to. They just kind of look at government and say, you guys don't have a clue what you're talking about. And government kind of wants them to conform and be like, well, you need to understand our process and what we have to do. And it's just a mess. I've read reports and stories of how the cybersecurity community or the technology community in general has kind of gone into two different camps. You'll have the West Coast Silicon Valley folks who kind of look at the government and what they're saying about encryption and the NSA and other issues and kind of look at them with suspicion. And then you have the new industry kind of developing in and around Fort Meade and the Washington, D.C. area, which, in full disclosure, I currently live in this area. So it's kind of an interesting division in the tech community right now.
Yeah, so moving on, we have our cyber tip of the week. I guess one interesting thing about all this RSA coverage is a lot of people, at least from the articles I've been reading, have been talking about how, it's sort of a little bit doom and gloom. People just saying there's not much that they can do or they don't have the answers and things are getting worse. But as we just discussed, like with the point of sale vendor using the same password, there is still a lot of simple things that can be done. So the tip this week is kind of beating a dead horse. If you listen to the podcast, I'm sure we've mentioned this many times, but at RSA, they were talking about how a lot of people have been moving all their information to the cloud as a way to improve security and reduce the risk of data theft. But they said at an RSA panel session, several security experts pointed out that authentication controls for both consumers and enterprises storing their data in the cloud is usually just a one-step process. And they don't even have two-factor authentication on that data. So, despite all this talk about how there's all these problems, there's still a lot of simple things like having two-factor authentication on your important data that's in the cloud that you should be doing, obviously, as a business. That's it for this week's discussion. Moving on, we have that interview with Proofpoint's Kevin Epstein, where we talk about their Human Factor 2015 Phishing Trends Report. The last time we spoke was in 2014, and I remember when we chatted then, the phrase that stuck out in my mind was you said that everybody clicks.
Yeah.
In fact, I think one of the stats was that 95% of targeted cyber attacks start with phishing. That's what you told me a year ago. But now, I know it's 2015. You guys put out a new report on phishing, so I'm just wondering what's different in the world of phishing today versus, say a year ago.
This was definitely the year that cyber criminals went corporate. We talk about this in the report, but everything about the attack methodology shifted. Unfortunately, they are good marketers, so they watched their feedback from last year, and as people learned to look out for things like social networking invites and fake order confirmations and things like that, attackers shifted. So what did they shift? Delivery times shifted. So instead of early morning before you had your coffee, the highest delivery point is now Tuesday between about 7 and 10 in the morning Pacific time. And then they shifted days of the week. Again, it used to be loaded towards the end of the week when you're kind of low resistance. Now it's much more Tuesdays and Thursdays, sort of high points during the business week. The lures themselves are no longer fake ticket confirmation. Now it's much more about have you received the attached voicemail? Have you received the attached e-fax? Which, if you're a business manager, well, you want to click on these things. Mm-hmm. And the level in the corporation is also being changed. The attackers last year were much more after sort of rank and file staff, and this year it's solidly middle management focused.
I'm curious if there's anything that sort of surprised you about those findings. I mean, was there anything that maybe you were expecting to see and then didn't see, or vice versa?
I'll go with the vice versa. We were looking for highly sophisticated modern zero-day attacks, and there were lots of those, but there were also a very large number of Back to the Future style MS Office macro attacks. That which is old is new again. The number of interesting exploits triggered by a macro. So the exploit itself might be a pretty significant and deep exploit, but the initiation that got that onto your system would be standard Office macro, something buried in a Word doc.
One thing that surprised me reading it was said the last 12 months saw a 94% decrease in the use of social media invitation and order confirmation lures, which you kind of touched on a little bit, but I guess, that's kind of one of the main things I think about when I think of phishing. So I guess I'm a little behind the times, I guess.
Well, it just means that, average everyday folks like you and me are not the primary targets anymore. Right? We've seen a huge shift from folks sweeping a wide net. If you were a cyber criminal 2 years ago, you did a mass customized campaign. Folks like you or me would get what looked like a social invite or an order confirmation. We'd click on it. Trojan would be on our computer, and it would attempt to tap individual bank information. And what cyber criminals realized is, that they'd get a pretty good haul in their net, but a lot of that's bait fish. My information is not particularly valuable. And instead, what's shifted, again, the volume's gone down, but now it's more like tuna fishing. Right, they're going after wire transfer and real large financial asset type attacks. And to do that, you don't need to get as many people clicking. You just need to get more of the right people clicking. So the good news is if you're not seeing e-fax and a voicemail attachment attacks or newsletter attacks, you're probably not a target.
I think overall the number was 1 in every 25 message was clicked by users. Is that pretty consistent with what you guys expected, or is that good, bad?
It's unfortunately consistent but bad. So, think about that number, 1 in 25. Well, I don't know how many malicious messages you get. I get a lot of messages. I don't know how many of those are malicious. But if I was to click on a link in 1 out of every 25 messages I got, I'd be clicking quite a few links per day. And if you think about an organization, even a small organization, let's say it's a 50-person organization, and assume that, one fish gets through per day. So now you're looking at one fish, 50 people, and a click rate of 1 in 25. Well, within a week or so, someone's getting infected.
Yeah, so I kind of wanted to talk about that because it seems, I've asked people this on our podcast previously, but it seems, phishing is always a problem. Like I said, we spoke a year ago, it was a problem. So it just seems kind of like the one constant that's never really going away. And, I guess you could argue whether we're getting better at it or protecting against it. So I guess just your thoughts overall on what can be done to sort of combat the problem, or if it's just something that's sort of going to always be there and you got to work on other avenues.
It's a great question. And, training's been raised. Can we train people not to do this? Training definitely has an impact on click rate. Better trained people click less, but attackers keep changing their tactics. So even with retraining, we found that training alone is not sufficient. And there has to be some form of mechanized or automated targeted attack protection. And bluntly, more importantly these days, automated threat response, given the speed of exfiltration on these things. It's one of those situations where phishing is clearly here to stay. Right? We're on the cusp of RSA every year. If you walk the show floors at any of the major security conferences, every demonstration begins with the phrase, so if fish comes into the organization and we need better protection against the initial fish, But we also need better protection once it's clicked, because if you accept the statistical inevitability that someone clicks, again, that hasn't changed. Everybody clicks. So if you accept that statistical inevitability, you can reduce it significantly. But if it's still going to happen, then it's a question of how well prepared are you to figure out, from the many fire alarms going off in your organization, from the 30,000 alerts that are coming into your SIM system, which are the ones that signify real fires, and which are false alarms, and which are lower priority, which are the ones that say, well, the marketing person downloaded an adware toolbar, okay, we can wait on that, and which are the ones that say the CEO just downloaded the keylogger and it's actively exfiltrating every keystroke, right? That would be a higher priority. And that's not something we could ask any reasonable security team to do manually. So clearly there's a need beyond training for automated threat response.
Yeah, I'm also curious, like you said, middle management's being targeted more, and I think it said in you guys' report that the click rates doubled also in middle management. But if you look at like executives, I think from my recollection that their rates were much lower than, regular staff or middle management. So just wondering if you could maybe explain that to me. Is it that the executives are more aware of these threats and more cautious than maybe the rest of the organization?
I think it's a combination of caution and protection systems. So traditionally in the organization, we had a fortress mentality, right? So we had the big firewalls. It's our big castle with a wall around it, and then you protect the king. So within security organizations, special attention was paid to the systems to which chief officers had access. Right? Their email might receive extra screening. Their laptops get checked more often, et cetera. And of course, they by nature hopefully are more cautious in what they click. Additionally, the types of email they receive, yes, they probably receive a similar volume, but many times they have administrators in front of them sorting through mail, and so it's rare that they would get a phish that would come all the way through and be compelling for them to click. Versus, again, rank and file and middle management, fewer screeners, perhaps less security, and a higher degree of just information overload. If you're a middle manager going through 100 email messages in your mailbox early on a Tuesday morning, you're just click, get it out there, delete, respond, answer. What's this? A fax? Click the fax. Okay, that's a junk fax. Throw it away. 5 minutes later, you won't even remember having clicked on that attachment, but someone will notice.
Yeah, and I guess in terms of what is successfully working, you talked a bit about attachments. Is that the main thing that you guys saw is just an increase in people sort of, targeting that management with those types of attachments?
It's interesting. We saw a difference. Again, 2 years ago was long lining. It was mass customization of things like order confirmations or ticket confirmations, and the attackers have gone upscale and downscale. I'd call downscale attachments, because attachments may contain very sophisticated zero-day malware, but by their very nature, because that malware can't be changed, it's fixed in whatever it is in the attachment, that attachment has a limited lifespan. Usually within about 3 days, signature-based programs will catch up with most of the attachments. Sometimes it takes a week or maybe more. But at the same time, we also see a lot more use of, how to put it, inadvertent phish, parasitic phish, if you will, where a legitimate site, an industry analyst site, for example, gets compromised by the attackers, and then the standard industry newsletter that's been whitelisted comes in, people read through it, oh, that looks interesting, I'll click and go check that out on the industry site, and the industry site takes them down, a classic water hole attack. But it's sort of an email-augmented watering hole attack. They wouldn't think to click to that site except the newsletter comes in. So we've gone to more attachments and then more subtle watering hole augmented phishing attacks versus the previous year where the body was mass customized direct email attacks.
Yeah, I guess then sort of my final question would be just, looking forward. I mean, is there any, want to call them predictions or anything that you kind of see continuing sort of in terms of phishing that people should be aware of?
So I'd make two, I'll call them predictions for the next year, or prediction and a warning. The prediction is attackers, having gone corporate, are seeing results from it, and there's no reason for them to back off. Especially notable in our report, as much as people make fun of sales and marketing clicking on malicious links, supply chain and order procurement were some of the highest targeted and highest clicking areas. And if you think about the types of mayhem and financial losses that can be associated with a successful breach of an order procurement system, you can easily see 7 to 10 figure numbers in that. So first prediction is attackers aren't done with being corporate. We're going to see large number losses from this type of corporate attacks, both direct financial transfer and just secondary losses along that line. Mm-hmm. But the other prediction, and I hate to say this is like I feel like I'm wearing one of those sandwich board signs that says the world's going to end. But everyone clicks. Right? Until we're no longer current type of human being, we're all curious. We're all under work pressure and stress. We all make occasional errors, and everybody clicks. So I see no end in sight to the attack trend that uses phishing as the primary mechanism into companies. It's a dominant threat vector today. It's a dominant threat vector last year. It was a dominant threat vector the year before that, and it will continue to be a dominant threat vector, arguably accompanied by social media, which is certainly a rising threat vector. Same tactics in social media. But I certainly believe this will happen next year as well.
That being said, you talk about how it's going to keep continuing happening. Everyone I seem to talk to always talks about how training is still, I guess, sort of the best bang for the buck in terms of phishing. Just wondering if you still agree with that, given how we're talking about, everything kind of keeping shifting and kind of staying ahead of the employees.
Yeah, I have mixed feelings about training. On the one side, it's certainly reduces the number of clicks and reduces the number of infections. It's undeniable. Training has a positive effect, certainly a weapon in the arsenal of a defender. That said, is it the best bang for the buck? I guess that depends on how much your training costs. The challenge at the end of the day is that no matter how good the training, it will never reduce the volume to zero. And all it takes is one of the wrong clicks. So personally, if I already was doing some form of training in my organization, and again, most security teams, you already have a firewall in place. Well, for gosh sakes, keep that. You already have training in place. You already have basic security measures. I would invest in the missing piece, the missing layers, and then go back and re-examine whether upgrades to other layers were necessary. So missing layers tend to be targeted attack protection and, most significantly, threat response systems. Again, I think a number of the headline breaches in this past year mention the aspect of, some system alerted on this, but our security team didn't get it in time. And the only way around that is arming your security team with some additional automatic weapons, as it were. So, automated threat response for a security team.
Yeah, well, that's all the questions I have then, unless there's anything else you wanted to touch on before we leave.
No, again, it's easy to be a doomsayer, and I want to be clear, that's not the space that we're coming from. Crime is a part of the physical world. It will be a part of the internet. Most people, knock on wood, that will not suffer a criminal event during their lifetime. And ideally, that would be the same situation online. The secret, however, is that in everyday life, we're all taught as we grow up to avoid certain areas at night and lock your doors and take basic security precautions. On the internet, I think that we're all in a high crime area and still lacking, in many cases, what could be considered significant or at least important security measures, again, like attack protection and security response systems. We think of email as this harmless little innocuous system, and it is a crucial threat vector. It's time we start locking our doors on that front.
Yeah, well, thanks for taking the time. I appreciate it.
A pleasure, and have a great day, man.
That's it for this week's Cybercrime and Business Podcast. As always, you can follow us on iTunes, YouTube, or wherever else you listen. And for more information, check out surfwatchlabs.com.